So sorry about the breakup of videos. I had to stop one and start a new one. So we're now on page 2, or the third slide of the PowerPoint on evolution. So if you remember, we kind of ended on the one that talked about the differences between Lamarck and Darwin. And Lamarck had the early thoughts, principles of use and disuse, and acquired characteristics. And Darwin kind of said, you know what, there's variations amongst populations. And those that have the best variations are the ones that survive better. They eat better, they breed more, they pass those genetic variations on to their offspring. And over time, you'll start to see entire populations that are going to change. It's just not individuals, but entire populations that are going to have those favorable variations within them. So if we follow Darwin's little trip, so Darwin went to the Galapagos Islands, and he actually wrote a book on all of his travels and everything that he found as he went through this whole idea of variations and evolution and how things change over time. And he wrote a book called On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. Now, he's the one that kind of comes up with this idea of natural selection, meaning that nature selects the traits that are favorable. And he traveled on the ship called the HMS Beagle, His Majesty's ship Beagle, and he followed the route to the Galapagos Islands. Now remember, at this time, most people are not traveling like this, so they're only seeing kind of the organisms that are in their little town or village or in their part of the world. Darwin's going all over the place. So he's leaving. You guys can follow. He's going from Europe. He's going all the way down South America. Galapagos Islands are a cluster of about 13 islands off the coast of South America over here. And he's seeing organisms that no one has ever seen before. And some of these organisms are tortoises, and there are a bunch of different types of tortoises there. And marine iguanas that actually dive down in the water and scrape the algae off of rocks. He saw finches. Darwin's finches is probably the organism that he's known best for. It was about 1831 where he got to those Galapagos Islands and spent a bunch of time there. And he collected specimens, he collected organisms. He would actually kill organisms and cut them open to see what they look like inside and see how they were different. Or he measured the beaks on some organisms or the shells on the tortoises. Because once again, think about it. We've seen these organisms before. They were amazed at what they saw. They've never ever seen things like these giant tortoises or these different marine iguanas that were there, or the different birds that were in that particular area. And what he saw as he went through this is that he noticed that organisms were well suited to survive in the environment in which they lived. And what I mean by that, of those 13 different islands, he noticed that those islands were all a little bit different. And those islands all had different types of food on them. And the finches that lived on those islands had evolved to survive best on them. So in other words, if they had to dig into wood to pull out insects, they had long, sharp beaks. Or if they had to break open larger nuts, they had chunky beaks, short, chunky beaks that were allowed to break those open. He saw that these organisms were suited to survive in the environment in which they lived. Variations had occurred. Those that had the best variations survived the best. So this is kind of what Darwin's finches look like. And like I said, this is kind of Darwin's species of what he's known for with evolution. So the finches on the island all had different beaks. And these are some of the ideas that you guys will see here. So some really long ones, some chunky beaks that could break things open, ones that can maybe get medium-sized seeds, maybe little seeds, and they're all a little bit different. So these finches basically adapted to the environment, and they had different variations, and those that had the best variations for those beaks evolved and survived best and passed that variation on generation after generation. So after years and years and years, could be millions of years, we'll start to see new populations. So the thing to remember, it's not like, oh, we have a favorable beak. Oh, next generation, the whole population has that particular beak. We don't see evolution occur from generation to generation. It usually takes thousands, if not millions of years to form these new species. But those with favorable traits ate better, survived better. It keeps coming back to the same general idea. Those that did not eat, they died. The good genes get passed on, bad genes die out. Eventually we make new species, could be thousands, if not millions of years. So they all evolved. All these particular finches that we see here, they actually all evolved from one ancestral finch that was found on those Galapagos Islands. Those Galapagos Islands once were one giant island that began to kind of shift apart and break apart, and the climates were a little different and the food sources were a little different on them. So they all adapted to the islands in which they lived on. This next one you guys don't have within your notes that are on that particular sheet, but it's kind of going through the same one that we saw on slide number 2. So it's kind of looking at the differences between Darwin and Lamarck here for you guys. It's just going through the 2 different ones, and it's showing you some difference of them. We know that Lamarck, whose theory was disproved, law and disuse and acquired traits, kind of like, you know, if you're a bodybuilder, your children will be born with very large muscles. You get a tattoo, your children will be born with tattoos. You don't acquire things. You don't pick up things. The more you work on body parts and develop them, doesn't mean that they get passed on to the next generation. Darwin's more this descent with modification. He says gradual accumulation of traits. So once again, variations within populations. We start to get accumulation of traits. So those with the shorter neck variation, they begin to die out. We get more and more of a population with medium and long necks. And over time, these gradual accumulations build up, and we get this population of those that have what are considered those favorable traits. They pass them on, and those genes are going to survive. Earlier on, I kind of mentioned this scientist by the name of Weismann, and Weismann was one of the ones at the same time as Darwin and Lamarck, and he was like, you know what, Lamarck is completely off his rocker. What do you mean use and disuse and acquired traits? Next generation picks up favorable traits. You don't stretch your necks, and the next generation of giraffes are going to have long necks. But he needed to disprove it, and that's where I said he kind of took mice and he chopped the tails off of mice. He actually did for 22 generations. Bred mice, chopped off the tails off the babies. Bred the babies without tails. Next babies, chopped the tails off. And he did this 22 generations. And after that 22nd generation, the baby mice still had tails. And the reason is it was physical attributes that they were kind of getting rid of. Their genes, their DNA still says, I'm a mouse that has a tail. And that's what their DNA says. Just because you chop off the tail doesn't mean that that DNA doesn't have that particular body part. So physical attributes don't get passed on. Genetic material does. So back to where you guys are now within that particular PowerPoint. Darwin hypothesized that the finches were once all the same species. We kind of just talked about that. They all descended from a common ancestor. Maybe this common ancestor looks something like this. As those islands began to break apart, we experienced what is known as fitness. Those who were best fitted for that particular environment in which they lived on are the ones that survived best. They inherited and adapted and passed those traits on. But it's important to remember that we can start to follow this little timeline, and maybe more finches evolved from this one and finches evolved from this one, but these are common ancestors, and they all evolved from a single common ancestor way back when, thousands if not millions of years ago. So once Darwin got home and he kind of thought about all this information, he's going along and he's writing this book, he actually comes up with this theory of natural selection. He coins the term natural selection to explain species diversity. And this is kind of the order in which they occur. So they're going to start with 1 and we end up with number 5. So think about it. Overproduction, competition, survival of the fittest, reproduction, speciation. Let's take it with an example. So little sea turtles. So if anybody gets a chance, and I know it's kind of iffy at this time, but if anybody gets a chance to go down the shore and you see those little sea turtles, especially if you go like Outer Banks, North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida maybe you see these little sea turtles. So this mama sea turtle, she comes up on land and she goes and she digs her little hole and she lays eggs. She lays about 100 eggs. Now, not all 100 eggs are going to survive, or not all of these offspring are going to be able to survive, but she produces maybe 100 eggs, or think like an insect that produces thousands of eggs. So overproduction is the first idea of natural selection. So when food and space are plentiful, more babies are made. That mama turtle, she's able to produce a ton of eggs. She buries them all up. Maybe she goes back out in the water. Competition. So when food and space are limited, individuals are going to compete for survival. So these little organisms, these little sea turtles, they begin to hatch, they start crawling. So some of them have, better genes than others. Maybe some are a little faster and they can make it to the water. Some are a little stronger. Some have a better sense of direction. So they're competing for these particular things, because if all 100 of those baby offspring survive, they're going to not be able to survive in the long run, because all 100 of them are going for the same food source, maybe the same mates, maybe the same space in which they live in. So there's competition. Not all of those offspring are going to be able to survive. Takes us to number 3, survival of the fittest. You're faster, you're stronger, you can eat better, you get more food, you have better sense of direction, you make your way to the water, you can swim a little faster so seagulls don't get you and the other larger fish don't get you. You're going to survive. You have great traits. So variation. Some of them have longer fins, some have shorter fins, and things like that. variation among the individuals in a species. So that species is sea turtles. Those are the traits that give them an edge for survival. They're going to live. So maybe, let's say 7 out of those 100 are going to survive maybe that first 6 months there. Those ones that survive, those 7, maybe 5 make it to the time where they're able to reproduce. But they have those favorable traits. So those survivors are going to pass those genes on. They're going to pass those most fit traits, the ones that allowed them to survive for that amount of time, to their offspring. And that goes back to Darwin's descent with modification. Gradual accumulations of these traits that get passed on. And over time, many generations, we're talking could be hundreds of generations, depending upon the span of the generation period. Some organisms reproduce a lot quicker than others. New species may arise from the original ancestral species. And that's what we're going to see. And that's what Darwin saw with those particular finches. They all arose from that same ancestral finch. So once again, it kind of just goes back, talks about the same thing. We talked about this a few times, but you could see how the giraffes in Lamarck's view, they're going through, they're stretching their necks, they all live, everybody's happy, everybody's got long necks, next generation. Here, variations, bad variations die out, good variations live, they'll pass them on to the next generation. So within these populations, and this will be the last slide for today, for this part of your notes that we have, and we'll have a little worksheet that goes along with this, types of adaptations that organisms have in order to allow them to survive a little bit better. So you can have morphological ones, which are more or less like structural traits. So there are some organisms that have stingers. Maybe there's some plants that have little thorns on them. Well, if you have thorns, someone's not going to be able to feed off of you, or someone's not going to be able to pick that flower from the ground because you got thorns on it. It's going to allow you to survive better. Organisms that have stingers that no one wants to touch or come in contact with, or other organisms don't want to eat. Maybe you have warning colorations, some snakes, some insects, some frogs, brightly colored. We usually know, oh, brightly colored, that means they could be poisonous. Let's kind of stay away from them. Some organisms will camouflage, look things up, stick bug, chameleons. They can actually kind of change their skin tone color in order to blend in with the environment. Mimicry, such as stick bugs. They mimic other things. You'll see some other little pictures, and I'll pop up some other little examples along the way. Where caterpillars actually look like bird poop. Well, organisms don't want to eat bird poop, so that caterpillar looks pretty good at that point. He's able to kind of blend in with the environment. You have physiological adaptations. This kind of goes along with metabolism or chemicals within the body. Poison or venom that organisms are able to produce. Certain enzymes, maybe they can digest their food a little bit faster. Hemoglobin, maybe they can carry a little more oxygen throughout their body, so they can maybe go a little quicker or do short bursts of speed at certain times. Behavioral, certain actions. Hibernation, only coming out at certain times of the day. That's an adaptation. Maybe they're hibernating at certain times. They're coming out when it's a little cooler. Hunting night or day. Courtship rituals. You'll see certain birds that kind of throw their feathers up and dance around, and they appear better. They have better variations or adaptations to their mates, and they want to pass them on. So you guys will see some of that. And I'll pop some examples up for you guys as well to go along with that. So this is the first part. We're going to stop there at the end of that particular slide, which means next time we kind of get together, tomorrow, we're going to go through some evidences of evolution. Some of these terms are ones that you guys saw within that dichotomous key, meaning homologous structures and analogous structures. And we'll talk about some scientific evidence for this term of evolution and how organisms change. So you guys will see a couple little questions that go along with this, kind of comparing Lamarck and Darwin and talking about Darwin's points that you guys see here. If you have questions on it, let me know. Otherwise, we'll touch base tomorrow and move on with some evidence of evolution. Thanks.